Giant's Causeway on the coast of Northern Ireland is one of the UK's outstanding natural features. Its steep cliffs and deep bays form a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Tourists and National Trust rangers saw the legendary fin disappear into a magical doorway within the rock face here at the Giant's Causeway.
At the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, tourists swore they watched a slab of solid basalt swing open like a door, and then seal itself shut again, leaving no crack, no seam, no proof it had ever moved. Everyone laughed it off. Rock doesn't do that. But one former archaeologist, a careful man with no permit and no crew, couldn't let it go. So he drove to that cliff alone, pressed a drill into the stone beside the door, and bored straight toward whatever was behind it. The footage his camera sent back is the reason nobody was ever supposed to look. The footage nobody kept. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Let me back up, because you need to know how he got to that cliff in the first place. The whole mystery began with a handful of scattered video clips. They were short, shaky recordings, quietly passed from one researcher to another, shared among enthusiasts who couldn't quite explain what they had seen. According to tourists and National Trust rangers at the Giant's Causeway, a section of the towering basalt cliff had done something that should have been impossible. It hadn't cracked, it hadn't crumbled. Instead, it swung open the way an ordinary door opens, remained open just long enough for something to pass through, and then closed again behind it as though it had never moved at all. For centuries, stories surrounding the Giant's Causeway had been tied to the legendary Irish giant Finn McCool. In Irish mythology, or as many locals like to say, Irish fact, Finn was one of the country's greatest heroes, famous for his rivalry with a giant from Scotland. The landscape itself had always been wrapped in legend. But legends were one thing. A moving wall of solid basalt was something else entirely. Almost everyone who watched those clips dismissed them within minutes, and, truthfully, most people would have done exactly the same. Basalt simply doesn't behave that way. It fractures under stress. It collapses as it erodes. Over thousands of years, it slowly weathers away. What it does not do is separate into a perfectly clean slab, swing open like a hinged door, and settle back into place without leaving behind a crack, a seam, or even the slightest trace that it had ever moved. That was why the videos were quickly written off. Some blamed clever editing. Others called them a simple internet hoax, the kind of mysterious clip that collects a few thousand views before disappearing into obscurity. But one man refused to dismiss them. His name was Kieran O'Hara, a former field archaeologist who had spent years conducting subsurface surveys and structural analysis throughout Ireland before eventually leaving the profession. He wasn't known for chasing mysteries or entertaining impossible theories. Quite the opposite. He was methodical, patient, and relentlessly guided by evidence. To him, data always came before conclusions. Kieran understood how easily the human mind could invent patterns where none existed. Anyone could look at an unusual rock formation and convince themselves it resembled a doorway, a face, or some forgotten monument. People have always woven stories around strange landscapes. But stories were never enough for him. He had built his career on avoiding speculation. He measured everything twice, questioned every assumption, and refused to publish a single conclusion that he couldn't defend with solid evidence. Yet, when he watched the footage from the Giant's Causeway, he didn't see an obvious fake. He noticed something almost no one else had been paying attention to. It wasn't the movement that captured his attention. It was the edge. The line where the moving slab separated from the surrounding basalt was impossibly clean. There were no chips, no broken fragments, no crushed dust, No visible seam, none of the microscopic damage that solid volcanic rock should have shown if a section of it had really moved. That single detail unsettled him more than the movement itself. Because if the footage had been manipulated, that edge should have betrayed the trick. Instead, it raised a question that Kieran O'Hara couldn't answer. And for a man who had spent his entire career trusting evidence over imagination, that unanswered question was enough to change everything. Kieran O'Hara wasn't focused on the movement itself. Everyone else who watched the footage couldn't stop talking about the slab that appeared to swing open like a door. That was the obvious mystery. But O'Hara barely cared about the movement. He was studying the edge. Again and again, he paused the video at the exact moment the stone separated from the cliff, staring at the impossibly clean line where one section of basalt appeared to pull away from the rest. The more he looked at it, the less it made sense. To understand why, you first have to understand how basalt behaves. Basalt is born in violence. It forms when molten lava cools rapidly, locking itself into solid rock before the heat has time to escape slowly. That rapid cooling is what created the Giant's Causeway itself, producing thousands of tightly packed geometric columns that fit together like pieces of an enormous natural puzzle. From a distance, those columns look almost engineered. Up close, however, geology tells a different story. Their shapes come from stress. As the lava cools, it contracts, and those forces tear through the rock, creating fractures that organize into remarkably regular patterns. They may appear clean to the naked eye, but under magnification, those fracture surfaces are anything but perfect. They are filled with microscopic chips, tiny cracks, crushed mineral grains, and countless irregularities left behind by enormous geological forces. That fact mattered, because whenever basalt moves, no matter how large or small the movement, it always leaves evidence behind. There should be crushed dust trapped along the contact line, fresh fractures branching away from the break, abrasions where two stone faces scraped against each other. Even the slightest displacement should leave microscopic scars that tell the story of what happened. Something. There is always something. But in the footage, there wasn't. No crumbling edges, no loose debris, no fresh fractures spreading through the surrounding columns. Nothing shifted except the slab itself. It moved with controlled precision before settling perfectly back into place, almost as though the rock had been designed to perform that motion and nothing else. That was the detail O'Hara couldn't escape. Night after night, he replayed every clip he could find. He slowed the recordings frame by frame, searching for the trick everyone else insisted had to be there. Perhaps it was an editing splice. Perhaps compression artifacts had hidden the transition. Maybe changing shadows had fooled the eye into imagining movement where none existed. He tested every explanation he could think of. One after another, they failed. Instead of exposing the illusion, careful analysis only made the footage more convincing. Every frame he examined removed another possible explanation, until he found himself facing something he couldn't comfortably dismiss. For the first time in his professional life, evidence was leading him somewhere he never wanted to go. That was the moment everything changed. A man who had spent his entire career avoiding fringe theories quietly packed his equipment, drove alone to the Giant's Causeway, and told no one where he was going. He wasn't chasing a legend, he was following evidence. And when evidence reaches a dead end, careful people don't invent answers. They look for another way in. O'Hara's search didn't begin with the mysterious stone door itself. It began with the rock surrounding it. The equipment he carried was perfectly ordinary for someone experienced in subsurface investigation. At the center of his kit was a Hilti TE-70 rotary hammer, a heavy-duty drilling system built to cut through reinforced concrete and dense volcanic stone. Attached to it was a 40mm carbide-tipped masonry bit, extended through several precision couplings so it could reach deep into the rock without requiring a wide opening. That detail was deliberate. A narrow borehole would disturb as little of the cliff as possible, while reducing the chances of destabilizing the surrounding stone. But, as important as the drill was, it wasn't what mattered most. The location did. That was where O'Hara's years as a field archaeologist became impossible to ignore. Anyone else would have drilled directly into the section of rock that supposedly opened. It seemed like the obvious choice. O'Hara never even considered it. He knew that attacking the visible face of the cliff would be incredibly difficult. Basalt of that thickness can resist drilling for hours, sometimes days, and forcing straight through it risks triggering fractures that could destroy the very evidence he had come to investigate. Instead, he searched for weakness. Not weakness created by damage, but weakness created by geology itself. Basalt never cools as one perfectly uniform mass. As rivers of lava solidify, they shrink unevenly, leaving behind subtle differences in density, hidden stress zones, and internal layers that cannot be seen from the surface. Most visitors would never notice them. An experienced archaeologist might. For hours, O'Hara walked the cliff face with no electronic scanners and no ground-penetrating radar. He relied only on his hands, his measurements, and decades of learning how natural stone reveals its history through tiny differences in texture, grain direction, color, and the way sunlight catches its surface. Slowly, almost patiently enough to seem obsessive, he mapped those invisible clues. He traced faint variations in the basalt, narrowing his search until one particular section stood apart from everything around it. The rock there felt slightly different. Not fragile, just thinner, less resistant. When he finally chose his drilling point, it wasn't aimed at the mysterious stone door at all. It was several feet beside it, close enough that if a hidden chamber or corridor extended behind the moving slab, his borehole might intersect it without disturbing the structure itself. In other words, he wasn't drilling into the door. He was knocking on the wall beside it. And whether he realized it or not, he was about to find out if anything was listening. Now, before we follow him any further, if you've been enjoying stories like this, take a second to subscribe. Most people watching right now haven't, and these are exactly the kinds of mysteries that disappear unless enough people keep them alive. It only takes a second, and it helps make sure the next forgotten discovery finds its way to you as well. Then O'Hara positioned the drill against the carefully chosen section of basalt, steadied his grip, squeezed the trigger, and what happened next unfolded far faster than he could possibly have anticipated. The drill bit bit steadily into the basalt exactly as O'Hara expected it to. The first layer offered the kind of resistance every geologist would recognize. Dense, hard, unyielding. Every vibration traveling back through the hilty rotary hammer felt familiar. The unmistakable feedback of solid volcanic rock resisting the cut. There were no hollow echoes, no hidden voids, no unexpected fractures waiting beneath the surface. Even the dust spilling from the borehole looked completely ordinary. Fine, dark volcanic powder collected around the opening exactly the way basalt under stress always does. For several long minutes, nothing happened. O'Hara refused to rush. He maintained steady pressure on the drill, adjusting the angle by tiny fractions whenever the heat began building inside the bit. Every movement was deliberate, every correction measured. Years of fieldwork had taught him that impatience destroys evidence faster than almost anything else. The rock behaved exactly the way basalt was supposed to behave. Until, without warning, it didn't. The change wasn't gradual. There was no subtle softening inside the stone, no slow decrease in resistance, no change in the sound of the drill to suggest it was approaching a fracture or a natural cavity. 1 second, the carbide tip was forcing its way through dense volcanic rock. The next, there was nothing. The resistance vanished so suddenly that the entire drill lunged forward several inches before O'Hara could catch it. His body had been leaning against the force, pushing back through the tool, and when that force disappeared, he nearly stumbled with it. The violent grinding vibration stopped instantly. In its place came something he hadn't expected to feel. Hollowness. The drill was no longer cutting stone. It was turning freely through open space. His finger came off the trigger immediately. Silence returned to the cliff. O'Hara stood perfectly still, the drill bit extending into whatever lay beyond the rock, while his mind raced ahead of his eyes. He hadn't seen anything yet. He hadn't inserted a camera. He hadn't confirmed a chamber. But he already knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had just broken into something that had never been meant to be opened. The only question now was whether he should look inside. Instead of widening the hole immediately, O'Hara did something that perfectly reflected the kind of man he was. He listened. It sounds simple, but to him it was the most important test he could perform before disturbing anything further. He leaned toward the narrow opening and waited. Nothing. No rush of air escaped from the hole. No cold draft met his face. No distant echo drifted back from within. There wasn't even the faintest sound of shifting rock beyond the wall. Whatever space existed on the other side wasn't connected to the outside world through hidden cracks or unseen tunnels. It was completely sealed. That realization unsettled him more than discovering the cavity itself. Natural chambers inside coastal basalt almost never remain perfectly isolated. Over decades and centuries, seawater forces its way into microscopic fractures. Air circulates through tiny cracks. Moisture travels wherever the rock weakens. Nature is remarkably persistent. Given enough time, almost every hidden space eventually breathes. This one didn't. Not even after the drill pierced its wall. The opening remained unnaturally still, which meant the chamber hadn't simply survived by chance. Something had kept it closed. And if nothing from the outside had been able to enter, then whatever existed inside had either been there from the very beginning, or it had been deliberately placed there before the chamber was sealed. Only after satisfying himself that the space wasn't about to collapse did O'Hara carefully begin enlarging the borehole. He worked slowly, removing only enough stone to pass a small inspection device through the opening. He had already made one decision. Whatever waited beyond that wall, he was not going in after it. If anything explored the chamber, it would be a machine. So he unpacked a compact tracked crawler, fitted with a forward-facing camera and powerful LED lights mounted near its nose. It was built to inspect confined spaces, riding on rubber treads that allowed it to crawl across uneven ground while transmitting live video back to the operator. After lowering it carefully into the opening, he let the machine settle. He waited for the camera to stabilize. Only then did he ease the controls forward, sending the crawler into the darkness with the same caution someone might use when lowering a camera into deep water, never knowing what could be waiting beyond the reach of the light. This is where the story becomes difficult to tell exactly as it happened. Not because the recording is unclear. In many ways, it's almost too clear. The problem is that some of what appears on the footage refuses to remain consistent long enough to be easily understood. Certain details shift between frames. Others never stay visible long enough for a complete explanation. The complete frame-by-frame analysis exists elsewhere. What follows is only the portion that can be described with confidence. For the first several meters, the crawler revealed nothing extraordinary. Its lights swept across rough volcanic basalt, uneven walls, scattered mineral textures, and natural stone surfaces that looked exactly the way the inside of a coastal lava cavity ought to look. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly ordinary, and that was exactly what O'Hara expected to find. He had no way of knowing that only a short distance farther in, the chamber would begin revealing details that no geological explanation could comfortably account for. But the floor under the crawler was wrong in a quiet way. It was level, unnaturally level, compared to the broken rock back at the entry point. Like something had once flattened it on purpose. And keep the door in your mind as the crawler moves, because everything the camera is about to find sits parallel to it. Every shape, every beam, every pool of liquid is, in some sense, on the other side of the door people watched open. The crawler's lights found the first of the shapes, and ordinary was over. The suspended forms. They were hanging, suspended from somewhere above in a loose cluster, dull-surfaced, drinking the light instead of throwing it back. The footage won't let them be seen cleanly, and that's the problem. They don't hold still enough. There's a subtle inconsistency to them, a barely perceptible shift, as if their position isn't entirely fixed, even when nothing in that dead, sealed space should be moving them at all. Stop and sit with that for a second, because Oria did. Something was hanging in a chamber no air could reach, and it would not stay still. The floor beneath the forms was darker than the surrounding stone, stained, uneven, shallow pools of liquid scattered across it, breaking the crawler's light into fractured reflections. Oria pushed the unit on beneath the last of the hanging shapes, and for a brief moment the ceiling cleared, and the light spread evenly again. Visibility improved, but only for a few meters. He kept the crawler crawling, slow, deliberate, the way you'd move through a room you suspected wasn't empty. Every few seconds, the lens would catch another one of the forms at the edge of the frame, and every time, it sat slightly differently than the pass before. Not swinging, not falling, just not where it had been. A man who'd spent his career insisting that stone behaves predictably was now watching things that didn't behave at all, in a place that should have been as dead as the inside of a tomb. Then the air itself turned against the camera. The air that wasn't empty. It didn't announce itself as a wall or a boundary. It revealed itself through interference. And if you followed this channel through the Soviet subwrecks or the deep-water descents, you know that's never where the bad part ends. It's where it begins. The light from the crawler's lamps started scattering harder, diffusing outward into a faint haze. Edges softened, contrast dropped, and depth became almost impossible to judge. There was moisture suspended in that air, not heavy enough to fall as droplets, not yet, but dense enough to fog the camera's sense of distance. And the floor changed with it. The unnatural flatness gave way to subtle irregularities. The surface darkened in patches, drinking in more light than the stone around it. The crawler's tracks began leaving faint impressions behind them, compressing a thin layer of something that wasn't rock and wasn't quite water either. Shallow pooling appeared in the low spots, thin, uneven, throwing the light back in broken patterns that never formed clean mirror images. They rippled. Even when the crawler sat completely still, the reflections moved, which meant one of two things. Either the liquid wasn't still, or the surface underneath it wasn't stable. Oria slowed the crawler and dipped the camera toward the ground. There was no flow direction to the liquid, no source feeding it. It just gathered in shallow depressions and stayed, held by the shape of the floor. Its color was hard to pin down, almost black under direct light. But when the angle shifted, faint variations surfaced. tones that pulled away just slightly from the basalt around them, enough to suggest it wasn't simply water sitting on stone. And remember where this is? A sealed chamber parallel to a stone door that opens like it's mechanical. Whatever that liquid was, it had been in there with the door the whole time. The crawler moved